Clinical trials have measured patient outcomes the same way for decades. But what happens between those hospital visits? The gap is exactly what digital endpoints are designed to fill, using sensors and wearables to capture continuous real-world patient data that has previously been invisible. Dr. Sethi has spent over 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry, from clinical operations at Roche to digital health strategy at GSK, with one constant: the patient at the center of everything. Welcome to Tech Anatomy.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
My first question is that you've described to me your work as using digital sensors to obtain this accurate, timely data between patient visits, data that has previously been invisible to physicians. Can you explain what are we missing today with traditional clinical trials that we can do with digital endpoints that capture that change of picture between visits?
So I wouldn't say that they were completely invisible. I would say that they are probably less accurate, especially in clinical trials. A lot of assessments are done through patient-reported outcomes, which is more subjective. So it's about how a patient feels, about their quality of life. And bringing a digital device into that equation allows for more clinical outcomes to be measured in a more accurate way using digital devices. So I would say that it enriches the data, whether it be in clinic assessments or in clinical trials, so that the physicians and nurses have a better picture of the clinical picture of the patient itself.
And the way I imagine it is that the pipeline from this raw sensor signal to a regulatory grade endpoint that will actually be validated by regulatory authorities sounds very complex to me. Can you walk us through what it actually takes to turn, for instance, a wrist movement or a step into an endpoint that regulators will accept?
Yeah, it's not easy, and it does take a very long time, as we saw from Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and the SV95C. I Googled it earlier this year, and I think it took nearly 14 years from inception to actually delivery. Yes, hopefully it's not going to take that long now to develop novel digital endpoints, but the key thing is you're trying to build clinical evidence versus the traditional in-clinic assessments. And that takes time. It also takes money as well. But it's really assessing what you can measure from a device versus traditional methods. And it's also understanding what element of that measure you actually want to assess. So, for example, activity, sleep, vital signs. There could be different elements of activity that are associated with a particular disease area. So that is the first step, actually understanding what the meaningful aspect of health is, what the concept of interest is in the context of use. And what I mean by that is, out of activity, for example, what element of activity would help you understand disease progression in a particular disease? So that's the first step. And then basically after that, you want to do a technical assessment of the actual digital device, which means that, is the device actually, what's the usability and feasibility from a wearer perspective? And also, what is the quality of the data that's being actually produced by the device? And then the next step is the analytical validation, which is really around the data that's coming from the device. Is it repeatable? Is it of good quality? Does it allow you to measure what you want to assess? And then the clinical validation, which is next, is basically looking at your digital device compared to your ground truth, which is your in-clinic assessment, basically. And this takes time because you need studies to do the analytical and the clinical validation, preferably with patients with that particular disease. Another thing that you need to do is, before you do all of this validation, is really start interacting with the regulators, because regulators have given us guidance on what we should be doing for clinical endpoints of novel digital endpoints. But there aren't any sort of, SOPs around it. So the guidelines, I would say, are open to interpretation. So it's very important to engage with regulators right from the offset before you do any validation plans, to present what your plans are and get feedback. And at every stage, before you do analytical, before you do clinical as well, it's important to revisit those conversations with the regulators to make sure that you're getting the level of evidence that you require for approval.
You mentioned the example of the Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Can you give us more details about what happened in that study? What was convincing enough for regulators to actually validate it, and maybe also talk about the signal that it gives to the rest of the field?
I was involved for a very, very short period of time while I was at Roche, and it was actually at the beginning. So I don't have the details of the actual studies that they did, but I know it took a long time. There's an assessment for Duchenne's, which is basically where the patient has to climb stairs. And the stairs, there aren't a standard set of stairs for this clinical assessment. So different physicians would use different stairs, different heights, different number of stairs as well to actually do the assessment. So there wasn't a defined measure in that way that was consistent across physicians. And with this device was I would describe it as a bracelet worn around the ankle of the patient, where that measure of actually stepping could be measured accurately and more with more enriched data. And I think the main reason it was successful is, firstly, Roche invested a lot of time and a lot of money looking at collating the right evidence. They engaged with the EMA and then the FDA as well. They engaged with the regulators to ensure that the clinical evidence that they were collecting was in line with what the regulators wanted. And also they had very good sponsorship within the organization, but also outside of the organization with external physicians as well, who really pushed for this to happen. So I think those are the key elements that made it a success.
As a pharmaceutical company, how do you make this decision of which digital endpoint, if any, is worth investing in, depending on the studies that you're building?
It's tricky. Not all go through. I would say it all depends on the leadership team of the company. And if the company is willing to invest, because like I said, it takes a lot of time and money to develop these endpoints, then I think you can be successful. I work at GSK now, and a lot of the teams that I work with would really like to do something innovative and do have a digital device in there. So I always take it back to, why do you want to have a device? What are you going to do with the data? And what does this data actually support? What is it? Is it supporting efficacy? Is it supporting label claims? Is it supporting differentiation in the market? So we always have to look at that problem statement in the beginning, rather than just putting a device in for the sake of it. So I think that's one key element of success. I think the next element is having a clear value statement as well, by adding this, what is perceived sometimes as an additional burden to clinical sites and to patients. What value does it bring to these customers? So to the patient, to the caregiver, to the physicians and nurses doing the clinical trial as well. And also, what value does it bring to the business as well? So I think those are sort of key elements that need to be considered. And then it takes great teamwork as well. So for me, I work with many inspirational, very excited teams who really want to move the needle forward in terms of innovation in clinical trials. But again, it's patient-centered. So they want to make sure that the outcomes that we produce are the best for the patient. So I think it takes that enthusiasm as well, because it does take a lot of time, a lot of money to do these things. And that is another key element that we need to consider when we're looking at endpoints. But I think that sponsorship from senior leadership is really, really crucial, because For example, the SOPs that we have in pharma, they are designed, rightly so, for clinical trials and not necessarily for the inclusion of digital sensors in clinical trials. So in terms of, I would say, roadblocks or maybe hurdles, you need a sponsor who's going to be able to help you remove those hurdles and actually be successful, because it takes time and patience to develop these endpoints.
And I guess it also takes patience in your relationship with the regulators, because you emphasized how important it is to engage with regulators and have this continuous dialogue. Is there something that you've learned from this dialogue that you hadn't anticipated when you first started designing the trial?
So I went to a summit about 7 years ago, which Roche does actually. It's the Clinical Biomarker Summit, and there was somebody from the FDA who was there in one of the panels. In my previous life, I was delivering clinical studies as a global studies leader. So when everybody said, the FDA, for me, it would put the fear of God in me, to be honest with you, because it's like, oh my gosh, the FDA has asked a question, or we have to go to the FDA with evidence. And this gentleman who was on the stage at the summit, he said, come and speak to us. Come and tell us what you're doing. Tell us what your plans are, because we are learning as well. And that really changed my mindset in my perception of the FDA, that it wasn't this big, scary body who was going to ask you lots of really difficult questions that you couldn't answer. It was more about, oh, okay, they are learning as well. And so I think that made conversations much easier, that not only do they want to sort of help us, they want to learn as well, because this was a new space. It's about, 10 years ago. So I think that helped prepare teams as well. So, when I'm working with teams, I think what I do is really tell them why we have to do these plans, why we have to do the validation, but also when they have any appointments with regulators, to ensure that we have questions around the digital endpoints as well. And then I relay why it's so important to do that as well, because otherwise we could spend a lot of time and a lot of money on doing this validation. And then if we haven't spoken to the regulators, they could come back and say, well, no, this isn't the right evidence, or dare I say, you've got too much, which I don't think they would say. I think that sort of moment 7 years ago really helped me understand that they're learning too. So why not have a really good dialogue with them and continue that dialogue as well? Because not only are we learning, they are learning too.
And do you see any differences between how different regulators in different geographic areas approach this question?
Not really. I think if something has been approved by the FDA, then the conversation with the EMA is probably slightly different, because at least you've got that sort of tick, and I think vice versa as well. But I wouldn't say it's different. I would say it's different from a measure. So what measure you are actually going to be assessing, and also the disease area as well. And it also depends on how much evidence there is already for that particular measure. So, for example, something like activity. Quite a lot of work has been done already on developing endpoints in the activity measure itself. So that means that, especially if you're using particular devices, then the conversations are very different. But there are so many factors to consider. I wouldn't say that you have the same conversations for same measures with the same regulators.
And we've been discussing this scenario where you are building your study and you use a device and you measure something specifically for that study. But what about data that comes from wearing a device in real world that has nothing to do with that particular study, but then using that data to inform an outcome that you're trying to measure in a study. So basically the secondary use of data that wasn't initially produced for that study.
So I haven't done that. When I've worked on clinical studies, we have just used the data that's come from the device that we've chosen for the clinical study itself. We haven't used any data from devices that say the patient is wearing. And the reason for that is that a lot of people wear consumer grade wearables, but they are really not, they haven't been approved by the FDA, they haven't been approved by regulators. And when you're putting, asking patients to wear devices, you need to make sure that they are safe from a wearable perspective, but also from a data privacy perspective as well. I personally wouldn't use data from a device that hasn't been vetted and hasn't been validated, like I described earlier, into a clinical trial and use that data.
This is an interesting point because this is something that I hear quite a lot from the pharmaceutical industry. And then there are other industries that you can talk to, for instance, the automobile industry. We had this conversation once with someone who was explaining to us that there's a lot of data that gets captured when you drive that could give information about a person's health, and that could eventually one day be used to provide data and inform a study. Do you think this is something that makes sense to you?
It does, funnily enough. So a few years ago when I was working at Roche, we were looking at potentially collaborating with a car manufacturer. I can't say who, but it was really interesting because we were looking at how the sensors in the car could actually help alert a driver of their health condition. So I think that that's sort of a dream of mine because I love cars and I love doing things for patients. So I think that is feasible. But again, a lot of work would need to be done on the validation of those sensors. And also one of the sort of the hurdles that we came across is, does a driver really want their car to tell them that they need to go and see their doctor? So that was the sort of moral dilemma we sort of came against, is that what drivers really want? This was a good sort of, about eight years ago now. So maybe there'd be more acceptability because so many people are wearing wearables such as, Apple Watch, Oura Ring, etc., and they want to know about their data and they want to know how they're doing in terms of their health. But that was one of the dilemmas at the time. But I would love to do that in the future at some point. So maybe never say never.
So I know you're a fan of cars and Formula One. Is there any parallel that you can draw between this field and the one you're working in?
Yeah, many parallels, actually. So when you look at Formula One, the focus is usually on the driver, but it takes a whole team to do those races at the weekend. And it's not only the team in the garage, it's the team back at, the headquarter sites of these world championship teams as well. So that draws many parallels to the work that I do as well. Although I'm sort of maybe the sole strategy lead, I work with a team. And without that team, I cannot do my work. And it takes passion, it takes drive, it takes a lot of energy. And I think that's the same in Formula One teams as well. And there are a lot of things that are happening in the background or people in the background to make sure that we come from a very regulated environment, that we are sticking to our standard operating procedures, we are sticking to ICH GCP, and making sure that we are doing the best for patients. So I see a lot of parallels. And of course, in Formula One as well, they are always looking at innovation and how to make things better. And that's something that we're doing in the pharmaceutical industry as well, in parallel with, digital endpoints, using digital sensors in our clinical trials to not only improve the efficiency of our trials, but also make sure that the outcomes are better for patients as well. So I see many parallels of, F1 and the work that we do as well. But there are many other reasons why I like F1. So yes.
Yeah. And we mentioned in the introduction your focus towards improving patient outcomes and keeping the patient at the center of the conversation. Is there anything that using digital devices has brought to clinical trials in terms of patient retention or engagement, or even the way that patients enter these clinical trials and stay in these clinical trials?
I think the greatest thing is, and what I love about the work that I do, is it allows me to have conversations with patients and caregivers, and also physicians and nurses, and actually try and design something that they actually want rather than what we think they need. So I was trained as a design thinking coach about 10 years ago by some fabulous people, Parker Gates being one of them. They taught me about a process where you actually understand what the problem is and then speak to your key customers to actually understand what they want, what they need, and then design something accordingly. And then you show them what you've designed and basically iterate on that to make it better. And this process is used, for example, throughout retail and through many other industries as well. And I think by working with your customers, and in this case, patients, caregivers, physicians, and nurses, when we're looking at implementing these digital solutions, that's one thing that we do certainly right at the beginning, is understand what they need and understand the acceptability of wearing a device, looking at the data, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you work with the clinical teams at sites and with the patients and caregivers, I think that helps them feel included in the equation of, including these in trials. But I think it also helps with showing the value that it's bringing to them as well. And therefore that might, I'm not saying it will, that might help improve recruitment. It might also help improve retention as well. But just talking theoretically as well. So if we're bringing richer data into a clinical trial using these digital sensors, so we're not looking to replace anything, we're looking to enrich the data that we already have. In the future, there could be a potential where we would be able to make a decision on a trial sooner because we have more richer data in a faster way. It could be that because we have this richer data, we don't need as many patients in a clinical trial. So those are the potential, I would say, advantages in the future if this becomes the norm. To include these digital sensors. But there are other digital ways in which we can improve clinical trials, such as reducing the burden of clinical visits. And instead of the patient having to come into the clinical site, you have a telemedicine visit, very much like we're doing right now, a video call where the physician can ask the patient questions about their health, and that reduces the burden of the patient having to come in to the clinic. There are also devices that the patient can use at home, which again means that they don't have to come into the clinic to have those assessments. Or, which is less digital, home nursing visits. So I think, my focus is obviously on digital endpoints, but the rest of the team that I work with also looks at what other digital sources can we use in a clinical trial that reduces the burden to the patient, but also the caregiver as well, who I think is sort of an unforgotten customer, so that to potentially support recruitment, but more importantly, some of these clinical trials are very long. So how do we reduce the burden to the patient and the caregiver and potentially support retention in the trial?
Well, we will conclude this episode on this projection into the future. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview and for telling us about all this the mechanics of digital endpoints, how they work, and how they can actually change clinical trials in the future. Thank you so much, Sumu.
Thank you so much. Thank you.